Hello, everybody, and welcome to this screencast on Death of a Salesman and the playwright Arthur Miller, who wrote Death of a Salesman. This is a very famous American play, maybe one of the most famous American plays, and this is how we'll be kind of ending our semester. I'm going to give you some information about Arthur Miller himself, some information about the play Death of a Salesman, and especially some stuff that I think will help you get started a little bit more easier as you're reading it. Uh, so, one way to think about this too is, just to kind of front load it, we're going to be dealing a lot with themes about the American dream that are similar to what we saw in Great Gatsby, but they're delivered in a less romanticized way in Death of a Salesman. It's kind of an interesting continuation of the discussion about what the American dream is and how attainable it is. So keep that in mind as we read. Hopefully, you'll enjoy it. It's not a hard read, especially once you get into it. There is also, just FYI, a pretty good film adaptation that's almost word for word with the script on Amazon Prime if you want to search for it, starring Dustin Hoffman. And it's pretty good. So if you do watch that, I'd recommend reading the text first, then watching the film just to kind of help you understand if you would like. Anyway, let's get started. All right, there's Arthur Miller there. That's him when he's a little bit older. He was one of three major big American dramatists and playwrights in the mid 20th century. American literature had been more recognized up till then for poetry and for novels. You didn't have a lot of important playwrights coming out of America until you hit kind of like the 40s. And these are the big three, probably most famous American playwrights of all time at this point, but definitely of that era, and definitely for the big three playwrights that made American drama or American plays important and well respected. So there's Eugene O'Neill. He's probably the biggest, most important as far as coming first in establishing the importance of American theater. Arthur Miller was there too. We're going to talk about him. And then Tennessee Williams. You might have heard at least of the names of some of his plays like Cat on a Hot Tin Roof or A Streetcar Named Desire. Those are some really famous plays, been made into some famous movies as well. Eugene O'Neill, I don't know if you really would have heard of many of his plays. He wrote The Iceman Cometh, A Long Day's Journey into Night. I wouldn't think that many teenagers would read much Eugene O'Neill, but you might like Tennessee Williams, and I think you'll like Arthur Miller. So Miller was born in 1915. He passed away in 2005. So he was, alive till fairly recently. And he's one of the most famous American playwrights. And he has some famous plays. All My Sons is very famous. That came out in 1947. And then Death of a Salesman, of course, that we're going to read now, is probably his most famous. And once again, one of the most famous American plays in general. But you might have also heard of The Crucible. It was several years ago. Mira Costa actually did a production of The Crucible through the drama department. I'll talk to you a little bit more about that. You might even have friends in other 11th grade classes that read The Crucible at the beginning of the year as part of the Puritan unit. It's obviously not Puritan literature. It was written in 1953, but that's who it's about. Miller won both a Tony Award and a Pulitzer Prize for Death of a Salesman. He was also married to somebody very famous for a little while. I'm going to give you a second to see if you can guess who it is. Think of when he's around. Think of who he could have been married to that was really famous. I think, that you would have heard of her. All right, here we go. He was married to Marilyn Monroe for several years, which is always fascinating to me. That was a kind of a famous marriage. Didn't last much longer than a couple years. Was kind of an interesting pairing, but that's a fun fact, a fun Arthur Miller fact. All right, let me talk to you a little bit about stuff he went through and the writing of one of his other famous plays, The Crucible, because it's just an important thing to know about him as a playwright. He wrote it in 1953, and it's a play that takes place during the Salem witch trials. This was a time during Puritan history where they thought that a bunch of people in their villages were witches, and they started putting everybody on trial, ended up hanging a bunch of people. And people could just accuse each other of being witches, and sometimes just being accused of it would be enough for them to kill you. And there was this big thing of you never knowing who was a witch and who wasn't. Well, he used this as an analogy for the communist witch hunts that were taking place at the time during the McCarthy era, the Red Scare, where there was all these people looking to find out who the communists were in their midst and get rid of them. And that happened a lot in the arts and entertainment world, where there were more people that might have been more interested in communist ideas and were just generally much more liberal. So a lot of times artists would be, and writers would be asked to name any artists and writers that they knew that could be communists. And if they didn't, they could be blacklisted and nobody would hire them. And the place where they would have to talk about this was before the House of Un-American Activities Committee. So in 1956, Miller had to go there, and he was asked to give the names of writers that he knew were communists. He refused to go along with it. You know, just so you know, it is legal to be a communist in America. We have freedom of speech and freedom of belief. So he refused to play along with that. And I don't think anything terrible happened to him, but some people would get blacklisted where they couldn't work anymore. But anyway, he made this play, The Crucible, as a comparison, saying we're just like the Puritans hunting for witches when we're looking for these communists, and he went through it. Let's talk a little bit more about Death of a Salesman, kind of the genre of play it is. So he did mostly realistic drama. They're mostly realists. We remember that from Huck Finn, even a bit from naturalism. But it's going to be dealing with social issues. Often he does it within families, but it's not romanticism. He gives like slice of life type of stuff where we see how people interact with each other, and he shows these kind of issues that will come up in families and in towns and stuff like that. So this is present in Death of a Salesman, this realism, but he also uses some of kind of the modernist experimentalist traits we've seen with some of the ways he deals with the structure and chronology of the play. So you really need to be prepared for this as you read Death of a Salesman so you don't get too confused. Here's one of the main things that you need to be prepared for. So he experiments with chronology. That's the way he puts like the flow of time in his plays. Everything that happens isn't just literally what happens one thing after the other. We're going to see that there are a lot of flashbacks. The main character, Willie Loman, is this older man. He's the salesman in the title. And he will have these flashbacks to life back in, 10, 20 years prior. And they'll kind of blend into each other. Him hanging out in his kitchen, then all of a sudden, like one of his sons will come in, but now they're the young version, and you're all of a sudden we're getting transported back into the past. Sometimes things will overlap with each other where he will be talking to someone in the future, but he's stuck in a flashback in his mind. And so they're getting confused as to who he's talking about. It's not that hard to keep track of, but you need to kind of know that it's going to happen. So I write here that Willie's memories will weave in and out of the staging of the play with a fluidity that almost resembles like a stream of consciousness writing style. We're kind of following Willie's memories, and he goes in and out of them. One thing they say in the stage directions is that that people will always use the door when they're coming in, like for real, but they'll just kind of go in and out of the walls or kind of come out onto the front apron of the stage if they're in a memory. But I think you'll be able to tell when they're in a memory and when they're not. Usually it says, like, if it's Biff, his son, he'll be talking, then it'll say young Biff, and we'll know that we're going back to young a younger time. So you'll be able to keep track of it for the most part, I think, but be prepared for that. So I want to just give you a little bit of what's happening at the beginning of the play. All of this is explained in the play, but I thought giving you just an idea of what you're heading into plot-wise will just help you kind of navigate it a little bit better. So we open up with Willie coming home from a sales trip. So Willie is a salesman. He goes to different countries, or not countries, companies. Like I think for the most part he lives in New York, but he has to drive all the way up to Massachusetts to do his sales. That's like the territory where he gets to do sales, and he has to go sometimes cold to different companies, see if they'll buy his stuff, and then he has to drive back home. So he's coming back from a sales trip, but he actually never made it up there because he almost crashes his car, and he just turns around and comes back, and he explains what happens to his wife. But you can tell that he's tired, he's out of it, he's just really seems exhausted, he's older, and he's kind of not doing great at the beginning of the play. And he arrives home late at night, and his wife Linda comes to meet him and talks to him. And so this is kind of the first opening scene of the play. Then we'll hear them talk about their sons, Biff and Happy. Those are their names, Biff and Happy. Now they are grown-up sons. They are probably in their 20s. It probably says, but it's probably early mid-20s. Actually, you know what? I think they're more almost 30, because it does say how old Biff is. Sorry, I blanked on that. But I think he's actually about 30. So yeah, in their 30s. Sorry. They live, they don't live at the house, Biff and Happy, but they both have come back to visit from their separate homes, and they happen to be staying this night in their old room together. So you'll hear them talking. Biff had been out in Texas working, and Happy has his own apartment where he lives in the city. But both of them have come back, and they are hanging out, and we see all the drama that happens between Linda, Willie, Biff, and Happy. All right, that should hopefully give you some information so that you understand what's going on. I have the link to the online text for Death of a Salesman on Canvas. Let me know if you have any questions. There is an assignment of Death of a Salesman Part 1 questions that you need to answer before Friday morning. Otherwise, I hope you enjoy it, and we'll talk about it on a Canvas live chat on Friday. All right.